If you're not from France and you listen to these people talk,
La transmissão aí chatsa de la faire quaset que ya tu une fois, c'est-à-dire que nei tres, c'est très drôle quand narquer ou tout est très la première di muy bras.
you might think they are speaking French, but they're not. They're actually speaking Occitan, a language spoken in the southern part of the country. Today, up to 23% of people in the region of Occitan speak this language. This is actually a good percentage when you compare it to some of the other regional languages of France. Within their respective regions, only 12% today speak Breton, 17% Moselle Frankish, 53% still speak Alsatian, but only 3% Provençal. And then the border regions speak around 30% of Basque and Catalan each, with Corsica keeping up to 60% of speakers of their own language. But all of these values used to be much, much higher because the use of French as a generalized language in the country is pretty recent. In fact, by the start of the 19th century, only around 12% of French spoke Parisian French as their native language. The rest spoke one of these local languages, which might be a little close to French proper or completely different. In the north, the so-called langue d'oil have varieties, but they're pretty similar. Also incredible that one of them is actually called croissant, which is actually the transition region to Occitan or Languedoc, spoken in the south and which itself have 6 main dialects. Occitan isn't super different from French, but it is a bit closer to Catalan or even Italian than it is to the French language. They evolved separately since the 9th century and are actually named after their respective words for yes, oui versus oc. Occitan pronunciation is more open and melodic. For instance, their word for earth, terra, is not the same as French, terre. But both of them come from the same Latin root. To describe a beautiful house, an Occitan speaker would say La maison est polida rather than the French La maison est belle. It really seems like a French-Catalan hybrid, almost. And other examples in vocabulary show this. Water in French is eau, but in Occitan is aiga. Same with night, nuit versus nuec. And throughout the country, many of these other regional languages show even more differences, or are completely different when compared to French. So if over 80% of the country spoke them, and if some of them were so different, why did that change? And why did French become so dominant in the whole country? In sum, what happened to France's regional languages? I think the best way to understand this is to understand the history of French itself and how it came to be the main language of France to the point where it surpassed all of these other ones. French is an old language. It descended from Vulgar Latin and evolved out of the Gallo-Romance dialects spoken in the north. That's why only 1% in that region today speak a different dialect, because they weren't that different to begin with. It's where French proper comes from, if you will. But while the language evolved from Latin, Gallo-Romance to Old French, Middle French until reaching the modern form of the language, its reach didn't really extend to anywhere else other than the north of the country. This is also explained by the fact that these were the core regions of the French kingdom from where they grew and expanded their territorial control. And also by the fact that they had, like the rest of Europe, a feudal system. So while the Duchy of Brittany could belong to the Kingdom of France, it had a de facto local independence and rule that conserved the region's unique identity and dialect. And Brittany is a great example of a local language that is completely different from French. They are more related to Welsh and Cornish because of their Celtic origin. For instance, their word for goodbye is Kenavo, with no French or even Latin connection at all. The structure and vocabulary of the languages are completely different. And while Occitan is more similar to French in the language aspect, I think you could say the same about their regional autonomy during those medieval times. Even today, Occitania is considered a whole nation within France, with their own incredible flag. Ever since the Middle Ages, the Occitan culture has been seen as different from the French. Half of it even encompasses the old Duchy of Aquitaine, which spent a good amount of time being ruled separately from the French kingdom. I think it was even English at one point. The other places that speak their own local languages are more connected to the border regions of France. For instance, Basque and Catalan are spoken here and here because they connect with the respective territories where the languages come from, the cultures within Spain. Alsatian and Mosellan emerged as a result of the contested nature of the territory between the French and the German throughout history, with its culture and language necessarily being a bit of a mix of both, but in some cases closer to German. Many French speakers wouldn't understand it at all. And Corsica, the island in the Mediterranean, didn't even join France until 1796, and arguably it did so against their own will. It has always been its own nation too. There's even attempts at independence throughout history. Their language is derived from Latin, but through Tuscan Italian and Sardinian, it's completely different from French. That leaves us with really only one other regional main language, if you will, Franco-Provençal, which is spoken in West Switzerland and Northwest Italy too. It was formerly spoken throughout the Duchy of Savoy with relevant impact of Burgundian rule. Also, this is sort of a halfway point between French and Occitan. It shares vocabulary with both, but retains a distinct sound and its own grammar too. Essentially, all of these places developed and kept their own language because their culture was different. And their culture was different because they either weren't a part of France until later on in history, or because even if they were a part of France, they were able to keep their local rule. This map, which estimates when each language originated, allows us to understand this a little better. Of course, that languages don't really have an origin date. They don't just sprout off the ground on a specific day. They form and transform throughout time, but these are at least the first times that we can find registered use of each of the languages. It shows us how, for instance, Basque has been around since 80 BC. In fact, Basque is absolutely fascinating as a language. While the Basque country is a part of Spain today, they kept their language and culture. Basque is the only pre-Indo-European language remaining in Europe. Essentially, it's the only place today where indigenous European language is spoken. And because of that, it's a language isolate, meaning that it has no known relatives among other languages. It predates the arrival of Indo-Europeans and languages like Latin, which later influenced the surrounding region. Because of this, its origins are still a little bit of a mystery. The other regional languages of the country aren't that old, and with the exception of Brittonic, they aren't that different from French, but they also developed on their own. Breton was established before French in around 800 AD. Historically, the region has Celtic roots which come from ancient settlers, and its different cultural identity has been maintained throughout its history as an independent duchy before its union with the Kingdom of France, which came fairly late too, only in 1532. Moselle Frankish and Alsatian are also dated back to 600 and 842 AD respectively, and Occitan is even older than French also, from 780 AD. Other languages might be more recent than French, although just slightly, like Corsican, Franco-Provençal, or Catalan, but they're still old enough to justify their local importance. And if we wanted, we could go even deeper and look at all the regional dialects within each of these languages, even the ones in northern France. The colors kind of group them up in the languages, but we can see how within Occitan, Provençal is slightly different from Gascon, or how within the northern languages, Normand is still a little bit different as well. And while France, through its kingdom, expanded to rule all of these regions, the people were, for quite a while, left to have whatever culture they wanted and to speak whatever local language they wished, as long as they paid taxes and levies to the French king. But fast forward to today, and almost everyone speaks French. And while France recognizes these as dialects, they recognize only one national language, French. So what happened? To understand, we have to once again go back in history, but not as early as 80 BC. And it all has to do with two words in English: language policy. Throughout time, the French government started giving more and more importance to the use of their own language. Because language is powerful, it can be used as an instrument of power and repression. Especially if you have a culturally distinct region that wants independence, removing such a key element of their culture as is the language can be a valuable tool. Unifying the country under one flag had been done, but to keep it, the language needed to be unified too. It started as early as 1539, but very slowly at this point. That year, through the Ordinance of Villers, Francis I of France established French as the administrative language for the kingdom and all its legal documents and laws. Previously, Latin was always what was used, and here it's an interesting point in history because historians disagree or are at least unsure about whether this change, this reform to introduce French was just to fade away Latin, maybe to take away power from the church, or if it was already an early move to try and repress these other local languages. All of the kingdom's provinces follow this, and their local bureaucracy started using French too, but the people, and even the local rulers, kept using the local languages among themselves. Actually, 2 provinces at the time were exempt from adopting French as their local legal language, and the reasons why are pretty interesting. Navarre was one of them. It kept speaking Gascon, a version of Basque, and Roussillon, which kept using Catalan. Navarre had just been recently annexed, and so the king wanted to assure their loyalty. Allowing them to keep their language was a good step in that direction, and Roussillon was only annexed decades after the law, and so it just didn't implement it when it became a part of France. This perhaps justifies why such a high percentage of people in those regions, around 30% each, still speaks these languages up to today. And when I said that the process was slow at the start, it really was, because it took another 100 years for the next step. In 1635, the Académie Française, the main French institution that rules on everything connected to the French language, was established by Cardinal Richelieu, the Prime Minister of King Louis XIII. It was created to establish the rules on how to use French, what the vocabulary and grammar of the language were, and to publish an official dictionary of it. The king and his government wanted to make sure that the French language was protected and used properly. Interestingly, today, the organization faces the same struggle, and it keeps the same goal. It's trying to prevent the Anglicization of French in modern times. But anyway, the French Academy was established more to regulate French rather than to implement it and make it replace the local languages. That came later, and curiously, at the same time as the Academy was temporarily abolished. Because you know what time it was? Revolution time. After rising up against the royals, taking power, and guillotining the king, plus a bunch of other people, the new French Republic tried to implement a lot of things. Like the bizarre French Republican calendar, which they introduced in 1793, trying to replace the Gregorian one. It was completely crazy. Weeks became 10 days long, months were renamed days too, and the year would start on the autumn equinox rather than January 1st. Craziest of all was that they reset the clock starting on year 1 after the revolution. It was used for a few years but then completely abandoned by Napoleon in 1806. They also tried to decimalize time so that one day would be 10 hours, each hour 100 minutes, and each minute 100 seconds, redesigning clocks for that. A decimal hour would equate to 2 hours and 24 minutes in normal time, if you will. But hey, they successfully decimalized currency and measurements, and we kept that everywhere, or at least almost everywhere, until today. So who am I to call the other projects crazy? But this time thing went away within a year. But along with all these crazy attempted reforms came one that was very important for the country and very important for us to understand the topic of this video, which was language. In 1794, famous revolutionary Abbé Grégoire published a reform titled On the Necessity and Means to Annihilate the Patois and to universalize the use of the French language. Patois was a term used to refer to the local languages. It came from Old French and originally meant rough, clumsy, or uncultivated speech. It really showed the contempt and sense of superiority that the French elite had towards these local languages. During and right after the revolution, regional tongues like Breton, Occitan, and Alsatian were condemned as barbarous instruments of counter-revolution. Many saw them as a tool to, quote, keep the peasant masses in obscurantism, because they couldn't read all the revolutionary texts that were published in French or keep up with the new political debates. This guy's report, who by the way went on to be the 5th leader of revolutionary France and serve in the Senate under Napoleon, confirms how widespread the use of local languages was in France up to this point. Remember, this is the start of the 19th century. It's barely 200 years ago. He wrote how it was unacceptable that the most advanced country in the world with regards to politics had not progressed beyond the Tower of Babel as far as languages were concerned, and that only 3 million of the 25 million inhabitants of France spoke a pure Parisian French as their native tongue. This report gave origin to 2 laws that established French as the only language in the country to be allowed or tolerated in public administration, life, and schools. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte refounded the French Academy to help fulfilling this goal, but they didn't really have time for it. France was engulfed in a number of wars, and Napoleon was trying to bring all of Europe under French influence. It was only decades later, long after Napoleon had been defeated, that the Third French Republic took upon itself in 1880 to implement a policy of literacy and established compulsory primary education to be done only in French. All other languages were prohibited from being taught at school, and not only that, but their use by students, even in the playground, was forbidden, and they were to be punished if they were caught using it. This made people afraid and ashamed of speaking their own tongue, contributing to them fading away. Specifically in Alsace-Lorraine, public use of Germany was also outlawed after the end of World War I in 1918. And from then onwards, the policy towards regional languages everywhere within the country became even more repressive. It's interesting how this more modern and truly democratic government of France ended up being more repressive towards local languages than those seemingly crazy and idealistic revolutionaries were. Maybe it's just because the revolutionaries didn't have the time and means to implement their strategy, but still. In 1925, the Minister of Education, Anatole de Monzy, even stated that for the linguistic unity of France, the Breton language must disappear. And we can imagine that his policy towards all the other local languages would be the same. Things got a little bit better after that. During the 60s and 70s, even as early as the 50s, movements for the recognition and respect of these languages began to appear. It was the post-World War II world, and things were a little better. The state recognized the right of local languages to exist, even if they didn't have the same official status as French. They allowed teaching them in secondary schools as a second language, and local media content was allowed to include them as well. But then it got worse again. In 1972, President Georges Pompidou declared that there was no place for minority languages in a France destined to make its mark on Europe, taking what I think is the wrong approach towards the idea of European unity. The idea of the EU shouldn't be to bring us all together under a common made-up identity that ignores national and local differences. It should be the opposite, a union of Europeans under our already common values, which allow us to keep our own cultures and identities, even our languages, all of those things safe because we are a part of something bigger. And I think that was the original idea too. I mean, in 1999, The Council of Europe passed a European charter to conserve and award rights to regional languages. The French government even signed it, but its parliament didn't approve it. This remains a public and a political debate within France up to today. Just a few years before, in 1992, they amended their constitution to clearly state that the language of the Republic is French, and the Toubon Law of 1994 mandated the use of French in all government documents, advertisements, all workplaces, contracts, and public schools. It left private life out, as well as books, speeches, and film, which I guess is at least something. In 2008, local languages were recognized by the government once again. But when in 2021 a law was passed so that they could be used in schools and local government, the Constitutional Council vetoed it. While the forced implementation worked, we saw that the percentages of people that speak local languages today are pretty low. Some resist and still speak their local tongues. I reached out to my friend Claire, who is from France, to ask her about this and get the perspective of a local. She mentioned how in Toulouse, part of the Occitan language region, city names and subway stations are written in both languages, how there's a local radio station that uses only Occitan in their transmissions. People living there use words that other places in France don't, and sometimes even their accent is influenced by this element of their linguistic history. This, I think, shows us how locals keep using it despite the efforts of the Central French administration to get rid of the languages over the past centuries. Despite those efforts, they are spoken less and less though, mostly by older people that are disappearing, and along with them the centuries-old languages of each of these regions disappears too. Do you speak any of these languages, or if you're from another country, do you have any other examples of very different local languages? Let me know in the comments, maybe I can make another video about one of those. Thank you so much for watching this, and I will see you next time for more general knowledge. Actually, wait, it would be cool if I said that last sentence in Occitan. Okay, Google Translate doesn't have audio for this, so I'm probably gonna mispronounce it, but I'm gonna give it my best try. Merci d'avoir regardé et vous verrez le cop que vient permet de connaissances generales. Probably butchered that, but I tried.